A flight attendant kicked Michael Jordan out of first class, but what happened next shocked the entire crew. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. Flight attendant kicked Michael Jordan out of first class, but what happened next shocked the entire crew. Discover how one moment of prejudice turned into a powerful lesson for everyone involved. Subscribe for more impactful stories and share this video with your friends. Michael Jordan awoke to the soft hum of his alarm, a sound he had carefully chosen to avoid the jarring starts that had become all too common in his high-paced life. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of his spacious yet understated bedroom, casting long, gentle shadows on the wooden floor. He sat up on the edge of his bed, his feet touching the cool surface, and took a deep breath. Today, he told himself, was going to be different. No press conferences, no endorsements, no expectations. Just one quiet day to himself, away from the demands of being a legend. Michael had planned this trip weeks in advance, deliberately choosing a destination that would allow him to unwind and recharge. He'd avoided telling his team or even his closest friends, knowing they'd insist on making arrangements that would inevitably attract attention. The goal was simplicity, anonymity, and peace. As he moved through his morning routine, the memories of his early years in basketball played in his mind like an old film reel. Back then, his world had been smaller, quieter. He could walk into a gym, pick up a ball, and lose himself in the rhythm of the game without the weight of millions of eyes on him. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. By the time he stepped out of his front door, dressed in a simple gray tracksuit and a black cap pulled low over his brow, the world outside had already begun to stir. The chirping of birds was slowly drowned out by the distant hum of traffic, and the air carried the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee from a neighbor's kitchen. He slipped into his car, grateful for the tinted windows that offered a barrier between himself and the outside world. The drive to the airport was uneventful, which was exactly what Michael had hoped for. He parked in a secluded corner of the lot, far from the chaos of the main entrance, and walked briskly towards the terminal. The automatic doors slid open, welcoming him into a space filled with the familiar sounds of an airport, the rhythmic beeping of scanners, the rolling of suitcases, and the indistinct murmur of travelers hurrying to their gates. Michael felt a sense of relief wash over him. Here, he was just another face in the crowd. At the check-in counter, the agent barely looked up as he handed over his passport. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, and within moments she handed him his ticket. "First class, window seat," she said, her voice flat and professional. Michael nodded in thanks, tucking the ticket into the pocket of his jacket. He'd specifically chosen first class for the extra legroom and the promise of a quieter cabin. The irony of a man of his stature seeking solace in such a space wasn't lost on him. As he made his way through security, Michael couldn't help but notice the occasional glance in his direction. Some were fleeting, curious looks, while others lingered a moment too long, as if trying to place his face. He kept his head down, adjusting the brim of his cap, and focused on moving forward. His anonymity was fragile, and he was determined to preserve it. The boarding area was already bustling with activity by the time Michael arrived. He found a seat near the window, away from the clusters of travelers vying for spots near the gate. From his vantage point, he observed the ebb and flow of the crowd, a family struggling to keep their children entertained, a businessman pacing while talking animatedly into his phone, a group of friends laughing over an inside joke. It was a tapestry of lives, each thread moving towards its own destination. Michael's eyes settled on a little girl sitting a few rows away. She couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, her hair tied in 2 neat braids. She was scribbling furiously in a notebook, her tongue poking out in concentration. Her mother, seated beside her, was engrossed in a book, occasionally glancing up to ensure the girl stayed within reach. The simplicity of their interaction brought a small smile to Michael's face. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, followed by the voice of the gate agent announcing the start of boarding for first-class passengers. Michael rose from his seat, slinging his carry-on over his shoulder, and joined the small line forming near the gate. He noticed a man ahead of him in a tailored suit, his posture rigid and self-assured. The man glanced back at Michael, his eyes briefly narrowing before he turned away without a word. As Michael stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool, recycled air of the terminal gave way to the slightly warmer atmosphere of the plane. A flight attendant greeted him at the door, her smile polite but perfunctory. "Welcome aboard," she said, her eyes flickering briefly to his face before moving on to the next passenger. Michael found his seat by the window and settled in, grateful for the privacy afforded by the small divider between the seats. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin and leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Outside, the tarmac was alive with activity. Baggage carts weaving between planes, fuel trucks maneuvering into position, and ground crew coordinating with rapid, practiced gestures. It was a world in constant motion, yet from where Michael sat, it all seemed distant and almost serene. The boarding process continued, each new arrival adding a layer of sound and movement to the cabin. Michael kept to himself, his cap pulled low, and watched as the passengers filed in. Among them was the man from earlier who took a seat across the aisle. Their eyes met briefly, and Michael could sense a flicker of recognition, though the man said nothing. As the final passengers boarded and the cabin doors were secured, Michael allowed himself a small sigh of relief. Soon they would be airborne, and he could let the world fall away for a few precious hours. For now, he was content to sit back and observe, a quiet presence in a sea of lives moving forward. The low hum of the engines was a comforting backdrop as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Michael Jordan adjusted his seat, testing the controls to find the perfect recline. He glanced out the window, watching the ground crew shrink into miniature figures as they waved the plane off. The familiar rhythm of travel, the sounds, the motions, even the faint scent of jet fuel, had always been a strange kind of solace to him. It offered a sense of routine in a life that was anything but ordinary. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for takeoff, Michael leaned back and allowed his thoughts to wander. For a moment, he almost felt like any other traveler, a man on his way to a destination, looking forward to the quiet isolation of the clouds. But the illusion was fragile, and it shattered as soon as he heard the words. "Excuse me, sir, may I see your ticket?" Michael turned to find a flight attendant standing beside him, her expression polite but tinged with something else, something cautious, almost accusatory. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed over his ticket without hesitation. The gesture was calm, deliberate, a practiced response to moments like this. The attendant's eyes scanned the ticket, and her smile faltered. She looked at him again, as if reevaluating his presence in the plush leather seat. "Ah, yes, seat 3A. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice strained. She handed the ticket back, but her gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary before she moved on. Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had seen this too many times before. The skepticism, the quiet doubt that someone like him could belong in a space like this. He reminded himself that it wasn't worth it. Not here, not now. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy suit lowered his newspaper just enough to reveal a pair of sharp, judgmental eyes. He studied Michael for a moment, his lips curling into a faint sneer before lifting the paper again as if dismissing him entirely. Michael caught the movement in his peripheral vision but chose to ignore it. He adjusted his cap and focused on the view outside the window. The plane began to accelerate, its engines roaring as it lifted off the ground. Michael felt the familiar pressure of takeoff, the weight of gravity pulling him back into his seat before releasing him into the air. The ascent was smooth, and soon the plane leveled out, cruising at altitude. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the flight attendants began their service. Michael's attention was drawn back to the cabin as the attendant from earlier reappeared, this time with a tray of drinks. She started at the front of the cabin, serving the other passengers with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When she reached Michael's row, she hesitated. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone cool. "Water, please," Michael replied simply. She nodded and placed a glass of water on his tray table. It was a small gesture, routine and unremarkable, yet Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it had been delivered begrudgingly. The attendant moved on quickly, as if eager to put distance between herself and him. Michael picked up the glass, studying it for a moment before taking a sip. He could feel the eyes on him, the man in the suit, the other passengers, even the attendants as they moved through the cabin. It wasn't overt. No one said anything outright. But the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken judgment, a subtle yet palpable tension that gnawed at him. A voice broke through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Excuse me, miss," the man in the suit called out to the attendant. "Isn't this section supposed to be exclusive? I didn't realize first class had become so accessible." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their meaning clear despite their veiled delivery. Michael felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to remain still. He had faced worse than this, on the court, in the media, in his life. He wouldn't let this man's words provoke him. The flight attendant glanced nervously between the man and Michael. "Sir, all passengers in this cabin are first-class ticket holders," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man in the suit huffed, folding his newspaper with a sharp flick of his wrists. "I see," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. He settled back into his seat, but his posture remained stiff, as if he was trying to physically distance himself from the perceived intrusion. Michael exhaled slowly, turning his gaze back to the window. Outside, the world was a vast expanse of white clouds and endless blue sky. It was ironic, he thought, how small and petty things could feel so suffocating in a space so open. As the flight continued, the subtle slights became harder to ignore. The attendants seemed to avoid his gaze, their service becoming increasingly perfunctory when they reached his seat. He watched as other passengers were offered warm towels, snacks, and refills, while his tray remained empty. When he finally caught the attention of an attendant to ask for a blanket, she responded with a curt, "I'll see if we have any left," and never returned. The little girl from earlier caught his eye again. She was seated a few rows ahead, her braids bobbing as she scribbled in her notebook. Occasionally, she would glance back at him, her expression curious but kind. Her mother, oblivious, was still engrossed in her book. Michael smiled faintly, grateful for the brief reprieve her innocent gaze offered. But the moment was fleeting. Across the aisle, the man in the suit let out an audible sigh, shaking his head as if in disbelief. Michael clenched his fists under the tray table, his patience wearing thin. He thought about saying something, about standing up and addressing the tension head-on, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. These people had already decided who he was and what he represented. Their assumptions weren't based on facts, but on prejudices that ran deeper than any conversation could reach. As the hours dragged on, Michael retreated further into himself. He focused on his breathing, on the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, on the sound of the engines humming steadily through the cabin. He thought about his younger self, the boy who had faced ridicule and doubt, but had never let it define him. That boy had grown into a man who had conquered courts and captured hearts, not by fighting every battle, but by choosing the ones that mattered. When the meal service began, Michael wasn't surprised when the attendant skipped his row entirely. He watched as the other passengers unwrapped their neatly plated dishes, the aroma of roasted chicken and fresh bread filling the cabin. His stomach growled in protest, but he ignored it, taking another sip of water instead. The little girl turned in her seat again, this time holding up her notebook to show him a drawing. It was crude but charming, a plane soaring above a sea of clouds. Michael gave her a thumbs up, and she beamed, her smile bright and untainted by the world's harshness. For a moment, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that not everything was tainted by prejudice. But the flicker was short-lived. The man in the suit leaned over the aisle, his voice low but pointed. "Enjoying your flight?" he asked, his tone heavy with mockery. Michael looked at him, his expression calm but his eyes steely. "I'm just trying to get to my destination," he said evenly. The man smirked. "Aren't we all?" he replied, leaning back in his seat. Michael turned away, his focus once again on the window. The clouds outside stretched endlessly, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the smallness of the moment. He told himself that this too would pass. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin remained, unspoken but ever present. Michael adjusted his seatbelt and prepared for landing, grateful that the ordeal was almost over. But deep down he knew this was only the beginning. The faint chime signaling the descent was a welcome relief for most passengers in the first-class cabin. Michael Jordan, however, felt the opposite. The earlier moments of the flight, the dismissive glances, the snide remarks, had set an uneasy tone that refused to dissipate. He had hoped that the slow march of time would erode the tension, but as the flight progressed, it only seemed to intensify. Michael leaned back into his seat, closing his eyes as the plane continued its course. Outside, the clouds drifted lazily, a serene contrast to the charged atmosphere inside the cabin. He had endured worse in his life, he reminded himself. On the court, under the glare of thousands of spectators, he had faced challenges that pushed his limits. Yet there was something uniquely exhausting about the quiet, insidious nature of this discrimination. Its subtlety made it all the more corrosive. The silence was broken by the sound of a bell. Michael opened his eyes to see the flight attendant approaching the row behind him. Her posture was stiff, her steps deliberate. She was carrying a drink tray, her expression carefully neutral. But when her eyes met Michael's, there was an unmistakable flicker of discomfort. She quickly looked away and focused her attention on the man in the tailored suit seated across the aisle. "Another scotch for you, sir?" she asked, her voice unusually bright. The man nodded, a thin smile tugging at his lips. "You know, I wasn't sure what to expect from this flight," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the cabin. "But it's been enlightening." Michael felt his shoulders tense. The man's words weren't directed at him, not explicitly, but their implication was clear. He resisted the urge to respond, choosing instead to turn his attention back to the window. The horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder of the distance yet to travel. The attendant placed the drink on the man's tray and moved on, her gaze studiously avoiding Michael's as she passed. The man took a slow sip of his scotch, savoring the moment before speaking again. "First class used to mean something," he said, his tone casual but pointed, "a place for those who earned it." Michael's jaw tightened. He had heard similar comments before, veiled criticisms disguised as musings, but they never failed to sting. He wanted to say something, to challenge the man's assumptions, but he knew it would only escalate the situation. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the man's words hang in the air unanswered. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. Michael hoped it would end there, that the man would lose interest and return to his drink, but fate had other plans. "Excuse me," the man called out, waving a hand toward the front of the cabin. "Is the pilot available?" The flight attendant returned, her expression a mix of confusion and unease. "The pilot is currently occupied, sir. Is there something I can assist you with?" The man gestured toward Michael with a subtle tilt of his head. "I just wanted to confirm that everyone in this cabin is supposed to be here. We wouldn't want any mistakes, would we?" The attendant's face flushed, and she glanced nervously at Michael before replying. "All passengers in this cabin have valid first-class tickets, sir." The man leaned back in his seat, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I see. Well, it's good to know standards are inclusive these days." Michael felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain still. He had nothing to prove to this man, he reminded himself. His worth wasn't defined by the judgment of strangers. But then the pilot appeared. Dressed in his crisp uniform, the pilot strode into the cabin with an air of authority. He was a tall man with a sharp jawline and a demeanor that exuded confidence. His eyes scanned the room before settling on the man in the suit. "Is there a problem, sir?" the pilot asked, his voice measured. The man gestured toward Michael, his smile widening. "No problem at all. Just wanted to make sure everything was in order." The pilot's gaze shifted to Michael, and for a moment there was silence. Then, in a tone that was both condescending and cold, he said, "Sir, can I see your ticket?" Michael's heart sank. He had already shown his ticket earlier in the flight, but he knew better than to protest. Wordlessly, he reached into his pocket and handed it over. The pilot examined it for what felt like an eternity before finally nodding. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, his tone implying otherwise. He handed the ticket back to Michael and added, "Enjoy the rest of your flight." The man in the suit chuckled softly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Cheers," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Michael's hands clenched into fists under the tray table. He wanted to stand up, to confront them, to demand respect, but he knew it would only make things worse. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, was often seen as a weapon when wielded by someone like him. The pilot lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking back to the cockpit. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on everyone present. Michael glanced around, searching for any sign of support, but the other passengers avoided his gaze. Their silence was deafening. The little girl from earlier peeked over the back of her seat, her wide eyes filled with curiosity and concern. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the hostility that surrounded him, and for a brief moment it brought him a sense of solace. But the moment was fleeting. The flight attendant returned, her movements hurried and her demeanor frazzled. She avoided looking at Michael as she began collecting empty glasses and plates from the other passengers. When she reached his row, she hesitated. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael shook his head. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. As the attendant moved on, Michael leaned back in his seat, his thoughts racing. He couldn't help but wonder how things had come to this, how a simple flight had turned into a battleground for his dignity. He thought about the sacrifices he had made, the barriers he had broken, and the legacy he had built. And yet, here he was, reduced to a target for prejudice. The hours dragged on, each minute heavier than the last. The man in the suit continued to steal glances at Michael, his expression a mix of amusement and disdain. The other passengers remained silent, their discomfort evident, but their inaction resolute. Michael closed his eyes, willing the time to pass. He reminded himself that this was just one flight, one moment in a life filled with triumphs and challenges. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about a system, a mindset, a world that still had so far to go. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Michael adjusted his seatbelt, preparing for the landing, and glanced out the window. The city below came into view, its lights twinkling like stars against the darkness. For the first time in hours, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. The journey wasn't over. Not this flight, not this fight. And as the plane touched down, he resolved to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles in his path. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, its tires skimming the runway before settling into a smooth deceleration. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white, a contrast to the heavy tension still lingering inside the first-class cabin. Michael Jordan kept his gaze fixed on the window, his reflection faintly visible against the darkening sky. He could feel the stares, some curious, others judgmental, but he refused to meet them. As the aircraft slowed to a crawl and began its taxi toward the gate, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. Passengers stirred in their seats, unbuckling seatbelts and stretching stiff limbs, their impatience to disembark palpable. Yet, for Michael, the end of the flight didn't bring relief. Instead, it marked the beginning of a final confrontation he could feel brewing just beneath the surface. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, collecting trash and ensuring that everyone remained seated until the plane came to a complete stop. Michael noticed the way their eyes avoided him, their smiles reserved for the other passengers. It was subtle but unmistakable, a deliberate act of exclusion that spoke volumes. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit was gathering his belongings. He glanced at Michael, his expression smug, as though the mere act of looking at him was a form of challenge. Michael felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had no intention of giving this man the satisfaction of a reaction. The plane came to a halt, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, thanking the passengers for flying and wishing them a pleasant evening. The announcement was met with the usual chorus of unbuckling seatbelts and the rustling of belongings. Michael stayed seated, waiting for the aisle to clear. He had no desire to join the fray of passengers clamoring to leave. The man in the suit, however, had other plans. "Well," the man said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "it seems some people had a much more eventful flight than others." A few heads turned, curious but hesitant. Michael ignored him, reaching for his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. "You know," the man continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "first class used to be a place of exclusivity, a sanctuary for people who truly belonged. But now," he trailed off, his meaning clear, Michael straightened, his bag in hand, and turned to face the man. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold, piercing. "Do you have something to say to me?" Michael asked, his voice measured but firm. The man smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Oh, no, nothing at all. Just making an observation." Michael held his gaze for a moment longer before stepping into the aisle. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him, their silence deafening. He had grown used to this, the bystander effect, the way people avoided getting involved, even when they knew something was wrong. It was easier to stay quiet, to pretend they hadn't noticed. As he made his way toward the exit, Michael felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to see the little girl from earlier, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael managed a small smile. "I'm fine," he said gently. "Thank you for asking." Her mother quickly pulled her back, murmuring something about minding her business. Michael watched as they disappeared into the crowd, the girl glancing back at him one last time before they were gone. The flight attendants stood by the exit, their smiles strained as they bid farewell to each passenger. When Michael reached them, their politeness faltered. One of them, the same woman who had questioned his ticket earlier, hesitated before offering a half-hearted, "Have a good evening." Michael nodded, stepping off the plane and into the terminal. The cool air hit him like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the cabin. He exhaled deeply, allowing himself a moment to gather his thoughts. But the reprieve was short-lived. As he made his way through the terminal, the man in the suit caught up to him. His polished shoes clicked against the tile floor, a deliberate sound that seemed designed to draw attention. "You know," the man said, falling into step beside Michael, "it's nothing personal, it's just people have certain expectations about spaces like first class. It's about maintaining a standard." Michael stopped abruptly, turning to face the man. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet power that made the man falter. "And what exactly is your standard?" Michael asked, his gaze steady. The man hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Well, it's just, certain people fit and others don't." Michael took a step closer, his presence commanding without being overtly intimidating. "Let me tell you something about fitting," he said. "I've spent my entire life breaking into spaces where people said I didn't belong. I earned my place in every single one of them. So if you think I don't fit here, that's your problem, not mine." The man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked away, his confidence deflated, and muttered something under his breath before walking off. Michael watched him go, a mixture of frustration and satisfaction swirling within him. He knew this wasn't the end of encounters like this, but he also knew he had handled it on his terms. As he turned to leave, Michael noticed a group of travelers watching from a distance. Their expressions ranged from admiration to discomfort, but none of them said a word. Michael shook his head, adjusting the strap of his bag on his shoulder, and walked away. Outside, the city was alive with movement. Taxis lined the curb, their headlights cutting through the night. Michael hailed one, slipping into the back seat and giving the driver his destination. As the car pulled away from the curb, he leaned back and closed his eyes, the events of the flight replaying in his mind. He thought about the little girl, her simple question cutting through the noise of prejudice and judgment. He thought about the other passengers, their silence a reflection of the world's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And he thought about the man in the suit, a reminder that there was still so much work to be done. But more than anything, Michael thought about the boy he once was. The boy who had dreamed of soaring above it all, of proving that he belonged no matter where he went. That boy was still a part of him, and he carried that spirit with him now, a quiet determination that refused to be dimmed. The taxi turned onto a quiet street, the city lights giving way to shadows. Michael opened his eyes, his resolve solidifying. This wasn't just about a flight or a seat in first class, it was about something bigger, something worth fighting for. Michael Jordan stepped out of the taxi and into the cool night air, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The soft hum of the city buzzed around him. Distant car horns, muffled conversations, and the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the bushes. Despite the relative calm of the evening, his mind raced with the events of the flight. The tension, the humiliation, the unspoken judgments, they lingered like an aftertaste, bitter and inescapable. The lobby of the boutique hotel was quiet when he entered, its warm lighting and minimalist design offering a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, her demeanor refreshingly neutral. She handed him a room key and directed him to the elevator, her tone professional yet friendly. As Michael rode the elevator to his floor, he let out a long sigh. The encounter with the man in the suit, the pilot's cold condescension, the silence of the other passengers, it all replayed in his mind like a looped highlight reel of his lowest moments. But what gnawed at him most wasn't the overt hostility. It was the apathy. The way no one had spoken up, the way they had all looked away, choosing the comfort of inaction over the discomfort of standing for what was right. His room was a sanctuary, a haven of quiet and understated luxury. He dropped his bag by the door and sank into the plush armchair by the window. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like stars against the darkness. He watched the cars below, their movements slow and deliberate, as though the world itself were urging him to pause and reflect. Michael thought back to the little girl on the plane. Her innocent question, "Are you okay?" had cut through the noise of prejudice and judgment like a beacon of hope. She had seen him, truly seen him, in a way that no one else on that flight had. Her kindness, however small, had reminded him of the humanity that still existed amidst the ignorance. But the weight of the day was heavy, and as much as he wanted to find solace in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had let himself down. He had stayed silent when the man in the suit had mocked him. He had avoided confrontation when the pilot had singled him out. He had chosen to endure rather than resist. Was it dignity or was it defeat? Michael leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes as memories from his past surfaced unbidden. He thought of the countless times he had faced discrimination, both subtle and overt. He remembered the coach who had told him he wasn't good enough, the opponents who had tried to rattle him with racial slurs, the critics who had doubted his ability to succeed. Each moment had been a test, and each time he had risen above it, proving them wrong with his skill, his determination, and his unyielding spirit. But this time felt different. On the court, he had always had the power to change the narrative. Here, in the confined space of an airplane cabin, surrounded by strangers who saw him as an outsider, he had felt powerless. And that feeling, more than anything, was what stung the most. The vibration of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him of a meeting scheduled for the next morning. Michael stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone aside. He wasn't ready to re-enter the world just yet. He needed time to process, to think, to decide how he wanted to move forward. As the hours passed, Michael found himself pacing the room, his thoughts swirling like a storm. He thought about the little girl and her quiet courage. He thought about the man in the suit and his blatant arrogance. He thought about the pilot and the way his authority had been used as a weapon. And he thought about the other passengers, their silence louder than any words. Finally, he stopped by the window, his reflection blending with the cityscape beyond. He had spent his entire life breaking barriers, defying expectations, and proving that he belonged. This was no different. The fight for respect, for dignity, for equality, it wasn't new, and it wasn't over. Michael turned away from the window and sat down at the desk. He pulled out a notepad and pen, the tools of a simpler time, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, each one deliberate and measured, but soon they began to flow, a torrent of thoughts and emotions pouring onto the page. He wrote about the flight, about the way he had been treated, about the way it had made him feel. He wrote about the little girl and her simple act of kindness. He wrote about the man in the suit, the pilot, the attendants, and the passengers. He wrote about the silence, the complicity, the failure to act. And as he wrote, he began to see the situation not as a moment of defeat, but as an opportunity, a chance to shine a light on the prejudice that still lingered in places it had no right to be. When he finished, Michael set the pen down and read over what he had written. The words were raw, unfiltered, and honest. They were a reflection of his pain, his anger, and his hope. And they were a call to action, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Michael folded the paper and slipped it into his bag. He didn't know exactly what he would do with it yet, but he knew it was the first step. The fight for dignity wasn't just about him. It was about the world he wanted to help create, the legacy he wanted to leave behind. As he lay in bed that night, Michael felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it never had been. He had faced challenges before, and he had overcome them. This was no different. The city outside continued its quiet hum, a reminder that life moved forward, no matter the obstacles. And as Michael closed his eyes, he resolved to do the same. Michael Jordan woke to the soft light of dawn streaming through the curtains of his hotel room. The events of the previous day still lingered in his mind, heavy like a weight on his chest. As he sat up in bed, the city outside began to stir, the sounds of car engines and distant conversations filtering through the glass. It was a new day, but the echoes of yesterday were impossible to ignore. He walked to the desk where the folded piece of paper from the night before lay waiting. The words he had written, raw, unfiltered, and unflinching, were a testament to his emotions, a way of making sense of what had transpired. Michael picked it up, unfolding it carefully, and read it again. With each line, the fire in his chest reignited. The pain and anger were still there, but so was something else: purpose. Michael had always believed in the power of action. On the court, it had been his driving force, the relentless pursuit of excellence, the refusal to back down. Off the court, that same drive had pushed him to speak out against injustice, to use his platform to make a difference. The flight had been a microcosm of a much larger issue, a reminder of the prejudice that still lingered, insidious and pervasive. He couldn't let it pass unaddressed. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he rarely used, one reserved for moments when he needed to cut through the noise and speak directly. On the second ring, a familiar voice answered. "Michael, "This is unexpected," the voice said, a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I need your help," Michael replied, his tone steady. "Something happened, and I need to make sure people hear about it. Not just the story, but the message." The conversation that followed was brief but decisive. Michael outlined what had occurred on the flight, the way he had been treated, the way the other passengers had remained silent. His contact listened attentively, asking only a few pointed questions before agreeing to help. By the time Michael hung up, a plan was already forming. He spent the rest of the morning preparing. The note he had written became the foundation of his speech, each word honed and sharpened to cut through the noise and strike at the heart of the issue. Michael knew that simply recounting the events wasn't enough. He needed to frame the story in a way that would resonate, that would inspire action and reflection. By midday, the stage was set. Michael stood in a small conference room at a local community center, a space that felt intimate and grounded. A handful of journalists and activists had gathered, their curiosity evident as they waited for him to speak. Michael's team had kept the event low-key, knowing that the message would carry more weight if it came from the heart, unadorned by the usual fanfare. When Michael stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out at the faces before him, a sea of expressions ranging from anticipation to skepticism. He took a deep breath, the words he had written the night before echoing in his mind, and began. "I've spent my life breaking barriers," he said, his voice calm but firm. "On the court, in business, and in spaces where people said I didn't belong. But no matter how far I've come, there are moments that remind me how far we still have to go." He recounted the events of the flight, sparing no detail. The dismissive glances, the biting comments, the outright hostility. He spoke about the silence of the other passengers, the complicity of inaction, and the way it had made him feel. Not just as a man, but as a human being. "But this isn't just about me," he continued. "This is about the countless people who face this kind of prejudice every day. People who don't have a platform, who don't have a voice loud enough to be heard. This is about creating a world where no one has to feel like they don't belong." The room was silent as Michael spoke, his words cutting through the air with precision. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his conviction filled the space, commanding attention. He spoke about the little girl on the plane, her innocent question a beacon of hope in the midst of darkness. He spoke about the man in the suit, his arrogance a reminder of the prejudices that still thrived in places of privilege. And he spoke about the pilot, whose authority had been used not to protect, but to belittle. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't the raucous cheer of a basketball arena, but a measured, deliberate show of support that carried its own kind of power. Michael stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding, and took a seat as the journalists began asking questions. The conversation that followed was raw and unfiltered. Michael didn't shy away from the tough questions, addressing systemic issues of privilege and prejudice with the same clarity and focus that had defined his career. He spoke about the need for accountability, not just from individuals but from institutions, and the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it was uncomfortable. As the event came to a close, Michael felt a sense of relief. The burden of the flight, the weight of his silence had been lifted, but more than that, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one flight or one moment. It was about a lifetime of fighting for respect and dignity, about using his platform to challenge the status quo and inspire change. Later that evening, as Michael returned to his hotel room, his phone buzzed with messages. Friends, colleagues, and strangers alike had reached out, their words of support a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Among the messages was one that stood out, a photo of the little girl from the flight, holding up her drawing of the airplane with a big smile on her face. Her mother had written a brief note. She wanted you to know she was rooting for you. Michael smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. The girl's simple act of kindness had been a light in a dark moment, a reminder of the humanity that still existed even in the face of prejudice. He made a mental note to reach out to her family, to thank them for their support, and to let them know how much it had meant to him. As he prepared for bed, Michael felt a sense of closure. The events of the flight had been painful, but they had also been transformative. They had reminded him of the power of his voice, of the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. And as he lay down to sleep, Michael thought about the road ahead. There would be more challenges, more barriers to break, more battles to fight. But he was ready, because this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, something worth fighting for. The city outside continued its quiet hum, a constant reminder that life moved forward, no matter the obstacles. And as Michael drifted off to sleep, he knew he would do the same. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like, share this video with friends, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories, and check out our other videos for more unforgettable moments. Together, let's keep the conversation going.